John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 129, which is the beginning of a new Garth Ennis story arc. He doesn't do a full run here, but he does come back for a 5-issue story arc. But just a little catch-up before we get into that. In the last issue, we finished the Paul Jenkins run of Hellblazer, and at the end of that, John was kind of left friendless and alone again, but at least all of them didn't die like at the end of the Garth Ennis run. So he still has those friends alive. They are still living their lives. They just don't like John and don't want to talk to him. So that's where John was left. So first things first, with issue 129, we got the cover. We see a very close-up shot of a half of John's face, and behind him, in the background, Chaz is on his knees, and he's holding a gun, and he looks very distraught as he's covered in blood. And we also see on this cover that the writer is Garth Ennis with art by John Higgins. And I believe John Higgins did the coloring for books like Watchmen and The Killing Joke. So I'm aware of his coloring, but I don't think I've ever seen him draw. So this was pretty interesting to read. He's got a different style than anybody else who's drawn John so far. Oh, but one thing that's really nice about this cover is we get the return of Glenn Fabry doing these Garth Ennis covers. So they always look great, and they're always super detail, and you should definitely check them out. And as we turn to the first page, we start off with John in a corner store, and he's in line trying to get cigarettes, and he is unfortunately stuck behind a baby who's crying, and John is not very happy about this, and he turns to us and he says, "I fucking hate kids." And we see the name of this issue is Son of Man Part 1. And as we turn the page, we see that John is actually talking to us, the reader, like he's breaking the fourth wall. There's no other person behind him that he's talking to. So he continues talking about this crying baby, saying, "And not just because they're annoying little bastards either. No, it goes deeper than that. See, what I want to know is, where did we get the idea children are innocent? Sacrosanct even. Bleeding little savages is what they are. And yeah, I know, it's some race memory left over from when we were cavemen. Ensure the survival of the species and all that. But for God's sake, we ain't living inside in caves no more, are we? Time to bloody evolve a bit. That's what I say. And that's the problem." And then he stops because he finally reaches the counter and he tells the lady behind it, "Oh, and give us 80 silk cut. Cheers." And then goes back to talking to us saying, "Everyone banging on about children being the future. The hope for all of us, all that. And they're fucking not." And then he pays for his cigarettes, and as he's about to leave the door, he turns to us again and says, "Who do they learn from? Us. Whose behavior are they going to pick up on? Ours. Those mistakes they're going to repeat? Ours. People are shagging away like rabbits, dropping the little bleeders all over the place and talking about hope. And all they're doing's carrying on about the huge fucking cock-up we already made. And then we must be giving a face that says he's a bastard because he looks harshly at us and says, "Oh, what? You don't agree? Think we're something worth prolonging, do you? Well, do me a favor. Take a look at the world around you, all right? And then try to say it with a straight fucking face." Then he walks outside and he lights a cigarette and he continues saying, "We are not children of celestial fucking light, walking arm in arm into the age of Aquarius. We are wankers who wreck the planet and piss on each other till half the world's starving and the other half's busy finding new ways to keep from noticing it. That's the fucking limit of our potential, believe me. So don't you show me your little bundle of joy and expect me to coo over it. Because all I see is another lazy, selfish bastard 30 years from now, belly aching about how its life didn't turn out the way it wanted. It's not its fault. And why doesn't somebody do something about the state of this, that, and the other?" And then he flicks his match at us and he says, "Anyway, having now established myself as a right miserable bastard, I'm off home to drink me carry-out and read me trashy novel. See you." And then he walks away from us and down the sidewalk, but then he comes back immediately, but he's closer now, and he looks at us in the eyes and says, I know. You were one once. I was a sperm once. But you don't see me wanting to cuddle up to a fucking wank stain, do you? Then we get a panel of him walking away from afar, so it seems like maybe we're just kind of following him, but we're definitely farther away, maybe because we don't like the way he's talking about us. Then we cut to John's flat, and he's sitting in a couch, and he is drinking a beer and reading a trashy novel like he said he was going to do. And as he finishes taking a sip of the beer, he looks at it, and it's in a can, and he says, "This Chateau Latour just ain't been the same since they put it in tins." But just as he says that, he hears someone screaming through the door saying, John, for Christ's sake, open up. It's me. It's Chaz. You've got to help me, mate. Please." And then John gives us a knowing glance. And then he gets up and he goes to the door. And as he opens it, he says, "So," like he's about to throw something in Chaz's face. But then Chaz just pushes past him and says, "Let me in. Move." And we can see that Chaz's shirt is covered with blood. And as he pushes his way past John, he pulls out a bloody gun, and he's holding it by the barrel, and he holds it out to John, and John says, "What the fuck are you doing with that?" And Chaz says, "John, Jesus, for God's sake, you gotta get rid of it for me. You gotta." And John tries to ask a question, saying, "But what's?" But he's cut off as Chaz shoves the gun into his chest, and then John says, "Here, leave it out." But Chaz just yells, "Take it. Come on, the old Bill's after me." And if you don't know, Old Bill is a slang term for police officers in England. And John, of course, is stunned by this revelation, because why would the police be after Chaz? And he asks, "What?" And Chaz tries to explain, saying, "They're after me. They fucking saw me come in. You gotta hide it. And me, and all. John, please, please." And John looks down at the gun in his hands, and he says, "Chaz, what do you expect me to do?" And Chaz replies, "Well, fucking magic it, of course." And John just kind of stares at him and says, "Magic it?" And Chaz says, "Yeah." And John continues, "Cast a spell on it, you mean? Like actually hide it with magic?" And Chaz says, "Yeah." And a very angry John holds the gun up and he sarcastically says, "Oh, right. Well, let's see." And then he waves his hand about like he's doing magic and he says, "Flibble, flobble, flibble, kerflup." And of course, that didn't do anything. And he sarcastically says, "Bugger me. It's still a gun." And of course, Chaz is not happy about John's sarcasm. So he grabs John by the tie and he pulls him to the door. And as he does, he says, "You fucking bastard, Constantine. You fucking wanker." And John yells, "Here, Chaz, fuck off." But Chaz does not stop pulling him. And he continues saying, "This is my life, you fucking prick." As he pulls John out to the front door, so that they can look down the stairwell, and we see police officers coming up, and John says, "Shit." And I don't think they've seen John and Chaz yet because they're high enough, so John and Chaz are able to run inside quickly and shut the door. Then we cut to John looking calm and collected as he smokes a cigarette and reads his book, waiting for the police to break in the door. And then John says to us, "See, the one thing people like Chaz never understand is you just can't use it like that. First rule of magic, when you're right up shit creek, when it's a matter of life and death, when you really, really need it to work, it won't." And then right at that moment, the police kick the door in and they yell, "Bastards!" And then we see a bunch of police in uniform and a detective leading them. And the detective strolls up to John and says, "Right, you. Off your arse. Where is he?" And John stands up and says, "He's folded up in the sofa bed with your missus, constable." And then the detective, or actually inspector, because that's what they call them in England, punches John in the stomach, and he says, "That's inspector to you, tosser. Detective Inspector McNabb. Knock your fucking teeth out, division." And then he lights a cigarette and says, "All right, tear it apart. Find the bastard." And as the police search his apartment, John is just on the floor, kind of writhing in pain because he got the wind knocked out of him. And we see the police just throwing a bunch of John's things all over the place and breaking them. And the inspector says, "Shooting in Whitehall tonight. Gangland thing. Funny place for it. But apparently this big villain's taking a shine to some high-class tart or other. And someone had a go at him coming out of the knocking shop. Messy business. Pricks drove off. Got us all out looking for him. Hour or two later, One of our mobiles spots some dodgy git walking down Highgate Road with blood on his front and a shooter, which the daft bastard keeps dropping. He legs it. They follow him here. Ground floor's empty. Pair of dykes and old geezers downstairs. Fucking weirdo next door. That leaves you. Where is he? But John doesn't answer. He just lays on the floor and says, ugh. And then the inspector says to one of the officers, Christ, put the kettle on in there, will you? And the officer yells back, just bunged it out the window, Gov. And the inspector sarcastically replies, brilliant. And finally, John begins to sit up while he's still rubbing his chest, and he says, no one's here. And the inspector looks around and says, is that right? And John continues trying to lie, saying, this bloke, whoever he is, he must have gotten out over the roof. And then the inspector says, been a fuck sight simpler if you told us that in the first place, wouldn't it? Then an officer comes up and says, bugger all, Gov, I guess reporting that they haven't found anything. And the inspector says to him, anyone having a go at Harry Cooper's lots, probably well on his way out of town anyway. Shit. If he's got any sense, he's on his way out of the fucking country. And at the name Harry Cooper, we see John's eyes get very big, like he recognizes that name. And then the detective turns to him and says, so. And then John looks kind of scared as he says, what? And then the inspector grabs John by the chin and he says, turns out you were just a smart-arsed little shit who should have kept his big stupid gob shut all along, eh? And all John can muster is, ugh. And I'm not sure if that's because he's being held by the jaw so he can't speak, or if it's because he's so scared that he heard the name Harry Cooper. But the inspector just thinks he's being non-cooperative, so he mockingly says to John for him to repeat, yes, Detective Inspector. And then he squeezes John's face very hard, and John repeats, yes, Detective Inspector. And the inspector says, good boy. Then the police leave, and we turn the page, and we see John watching them drive away from his window, and he says, right. And then he goes over to his couch, and he starts pulling the cushions off, and he says, right, you bastard, out. And then he pulls up the big cushion, and we see Chaz was, in fact, in the sofa all along, so I guess he cut out the supports or something really quick in the middle so that Chaz could easily hide in the couch. And as the cushion is removed, Chaz looks up at John and says, bloody hell, John, I nearly died then. And John says, out. And Chaz is confused because he thought John was going to help him, and he says, eh? And John points to the door and says, you fucking deaf or something? Get out, you mental bastard. And Chaz does not move and says, hang about. I'm sorry he twatted you like. And John cuts him off saying, I don't give a shit about that, you arsehole. I only said that to stop him finding you. But that's the last fucking help you get out of me, all right? Because if you think I'm going up against Harry Cooper tonight, or any other night, you're off your bleeding rocker. Now take your stupid gun and fuck off, Chaz, and don't come back. And then John begins to push Chaz from behind to get him out of the door, and Chaz is yelling, John! But John's not hearing it. He says, fucking go! But Chaz pleads with him, saying, John, they're gonna kill me. I'm dead if I go out there. But John doesn't stop pushing, and he says, well, that's your tough shit, isn't it? And as he finally gets Chaz out of the door, Chaz still pleads with him, saying, John, don't! I'm bloody begging you. I can't do this by myself. Come on, mate. Mate, it's me. But John just says, go. And Chaz continues, what about me missus? What about me little girl and the nipper? They need me, for Christ's sake. But the door slams in Chaz's face, and he hears from inside of it, that's their tough shit and all then. Go. And then Chaz is left in the hallway, and he pleadingly says, John. Then we cut to the inside of the door where John is leaning against it, and he says, why me? And then he goes to his bathroom, and he splashes his face with water, and as he stares into the mirror, the reflections of his eyes are staring at us, and he says to us, course I'm going after him. Just let me alone to enjoy me last few minutes of common sense, will you? Then we cut to John walking out of his front door and past his neighbor's door, and as he moves past, we see the neighbor door fling open, and we see a bald, muscular man only wearing briefs, and he's got his hands on his hips, and he's smiling, and he says, "Heard a bit of commotion there, John boy." And as John passes him, he says, "It's all right, Mr. Franz." And then Mr. Franz replies, "Not as big a commotion as the one going on in my pants." And John doesn't seem fazed by this. He just continues walking down the stairs, and he says to us without looking, "Don't ask." Then he passes another of his neighbor's doors, and it's an old man this time who comes out and says, "What? What?" And John says, "Get in and close your door, Billy." And the old man replies, "I fought in the war, you know." Then John walks past another of his neighbor's doors, and this time a woman opens the door and says, "Are you all right, John?" And John says, "Fine, love. See you later." Then we turn the page, and we cut to a pub, and Chaz is sitting at a table as John walks up, and Chaz says, "I didn't think you'd come." And as John sits down, he says, "Just start at the beginning, will you?" And we hear the bartender yell out, "Last call," and then Chaz starts his story saying, "Right, well, you know Kenny Tout drinks in the White Rose? A bit dodgy, but not a bad." And then John cuts him off saying, "Total wanker who lends money to idiots." And then Chaz looks at John kind of ashamed and says, "Yeah, well, I owe him about $3,000. So he's getting a bit shirty about the payments, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And all of a sudden, he tells me I can wipe the slate clean in one go. I'm supposed to pick this bloke and car up and drive him where he wants to go, no questions asked. Fine, it's tonight. I show up, bloke gets in and says, 'You the driver?' I says, 'Yeah.' Turns out he means the getaway driver. Next thing I know, I'm a fucking accessory to murder, John." Then John stands up and says, "So this is the thing," and then Chaz cuts him off, finishing his sentence saying, "The copper mentioned, yeah. Honestly, John, I don't have a bleeding clue what he was up to. He never said a word except to give directions. I mean, there we are, just turned off the mall, stopped at the lights for a second, and suddenly he whips out his shooter and starts firing at these blokes coming out of a doorway." And I guess because it was last call and they're the only ones in the bar, John is able to stand up and go get some more drinks for them while Chaz is talking. And as he returns, he says, "All right, now, who were they? Exactly." And Chaz answers, "Well, that's it, isn't it? I couldn't tell at first. It's so dark and the shooting and everything. But one of them got hit and he just fell over. And I turn, right? And I'm looking the bloke behind that one right in the eyes. And he's looking back at me. And it's Norman Cooper." And that gives John some pause. And as John kind of clears his throat, Chaz continues saying, "It's the big man's fucking brother. And this arsehole's trying to kill him and... Here, you all right?" And it seems like maybe John was clearing his throat because he was about to vomit or something. And he says, "Just go on." So Chaz continues saying, "Well, I wasn't having any more of that. I just floored it. I was so scared, I didn't even think about this tip beside me till I was half down the embankment, right? And fuck me if the bastard ain't bloody dead." And John is surprised by that, and he says, "Do what?" And then Chaz points to his temple and says, "Got this bullet hole right here, hasn't he? They must have shot back, and I didn't even see." And John asks, "So where is he now?" And Chaz answers, "Still in the car." And John asks, "Which is?" And Chaz answers, "Camden. I was hoping you'd get rid of that for me as well." And then there's a panel that's just completely silent, and John is just staring at Chaz as if to say, "What the fuck?" And Chaz can't take the silence anymore, so he bursts out saying, "Oh, come on. I didn't know who else to go to. I'm driving around in this dodgy motor with a dead geezer and a gun, and me prints are all over the bastard, and Harry Cooper's brother just seen me trying to do him in. The whole fucking lot's got to disappear tonight, or I'm dead, John." And John just quietly says, "Show me." Then we turn the page and we cut to the car, and it is parked under an overpass. And we see John grab the hair of the man who's dead in the passenger seat, and there definitely is a bullet in his temple. And John looks at the man and says, "Don't know him." And Chaz asks, "What, were you expecting to?" And John says, "Never mind. What you leave him in the front for anyway?" And Chaz answers, "Didn't want to stick him in the boot, in case someone came along. Anyway, he's all right. He looks like he's asleep." And John says, "Do you sleep with your brains running down the side of your head? No, don't answer that. All right. Give us a hand with him. So both men take the body, and as they're putting it in the trunk, Chaz asks, "What are we going to do?" And John answers, "Go to Southend." And as they heave the body into the trunk, Chaz says, "Now?" And John answers, "Yeah." And Chaz asks, "But why?" And John gets a smile on his face and he says, "'Cause I'm going to use me arcane powers to help you bung this thing in the duck pond I know down there. And then you're going to use yours to pay for me train fare home." Then we cut to Chaz driving, and apparently it's been a while because he's asking, "Is it much further?" And John, who's laying down in the backseat smoking, says, "Do you feel like killing yourself?" And Chaz answers, "No." And then John sarcastically says, "Then we're not in Southend yet." And then Chaz asks John, "John, you were pretty fucking spooked back there in the flat, weren't you? After the filth pissed off. I've never seen you like that in me life before, mate. I mean, you get a bit loopy sometimes, but normally you carry on like there's nothing you can't handle. To be honest, I didn't think there was anything that did scare you." And Chaz is cut off by John laughing, and then John says, "Oh, bloody hell. Let me put it this way, Chaz. If we get rid of that car and all the evidence in it with no one seeing us, and if Norman Cooper never lays eyes on you again, and if Kenny Tout keeps his mouth shut, then we're laughing. Otherwise, you've as good as fucking killed me." And Chaz looks very worried and his eyes get very big as John says that last line. Then we turn the page and we cut to the car sinking in a bog, and Chaz is asking, "You sure this will be all right?" And John answers, "Yeah, sodden miles from London, innit? Besides, all the best murderers drop their gear here. Got the gun?" And Chaz answers, "Course." And John says, "Well, throw it in." And Chaz was looking at the gun. I don't know if he was thinking about keeping it or if he kind of forgot that discarding it was part of the plan, but he says, "Oh yeah." And then he throws it into the water and he says, "So I was thinking," but John cuts him off saying, "One step at a time, Chaz." And then Chaz says, "What do you mean when you said I as good as killed you?" And John begins to walk away from Chaz and he says, "It's about 2 hours walk into town. We can make the first train if we get a move on." So they begin walking, and then we turn the page and we cut to them after having walked for a while. And John says, "Got out of London a bit bloody easy, didn't we?" And Chaz answers, "Yeah, I thought they'd be watching out for the car. Odd that." And John says, "That's if they even know." And I believe they're talking about the police here, like they should have roadblocks and stuff if there's a murderer on the loose. So Chaz is kind of confused by John's line of "that's if they even know," because he knows the police are after him, so he's not following John's logic here. And he asks, "Eh?" And John answers, "Look, just because this McNabb says half the Met's trying to find you doesn't mean they are. All right, so those other coppers tried to stop you. You've got a fucking gun on you. Of course they're going to stop you. But what if the shooting ain't been reported officially? What if it's only McNabb and his animals who know? And they're the ones who respond when the call about you comes in." And Chaz says, "What, you think?" And John cuts him off saying, "McNabb's bent? You've only got to look at him. He's exactly the kind of scrote I'd expect to be mixed up with the Coopers, and exactly the kind of scrote old Harry would call if he wanted this sorted with a minimum of fuss." And then he turns to Chaz and asks, "What's the state of play down the East End at the minute anyway?" I assume he's asking Chaz here if Chaz knows how the gambling operation is going down in East End. And Chaz answers, "Bit bleedin' mental. It was quiet until just recently. You had the Russians moving in a bit, in the Docklands and that, but mostly it was quiet. But what I hear now is Harry Cooper's lot are acting up a bit. Won't play the game, know what I mean?" And John asks, "How so?" And Chaz answers, "Getting greedy, really. Throwing their weight around. Been a couple of blokes fucking killed over it even. And all they're doing's trying to say, 'Hold on, this is our manor. Leave it out, plenty for everyone.' But you know Harry. First squeak of trouble, him and his boys send someone round to cut your head off. I saw Harry once, back in the 70s. He was a big bloke even then. Had all these bodyguards around him. Not one of them under 6 foot. But next to him, they looked like the 7 dwarves. He had real, what's name?" And John guesses, "Presence?" And Chaz says, "Yeah, that's right. And I mean, this is from 20 yards away. I never actually met him. And John says, I did. He said he was going to kill me, along with the only two people I ever loved. And then Chaz stops dead in his tracks, but John keeps walking, and Chaz calls after him, what? And then he begins to run up to John and he says, well, why? And John answers, I got the impression I was some sort of threat. And Chaz asks, but I mean, fuck me, John. You met Harry Cooper and walked away in one piece? How? I mean, what was he like? And John answers, dog shit. Then we get a panel of John remembering what Harry Cooper looked like, and he looks kind of like your standard kind of big, muscly mob guy. He's got a suit on, he's got a thin pencil mustache, a big nose that looks like it's been broken a couple times, and slicked back dark hair and a very hard gaze. And John gives his own description of the man, saying, he's pretty much your classic South London gang lord. Old-fashioned sort, you know? And then John does a mock accent here, and I'm not sure if it's supposed to be Italian or some other kind of British accent, I don't know. So I'm going to read it as it's spelled out. So he says, comes from a days when we was all in it together, all looking out for each other and that. And then he stops doing the accent and continues saying, he's probably got 2,000 morons ready to swear blind. He's a proper gent and core blimey, he loved his old mom. And one look in that bastard's eyes, and you know he's a fucking monster, ought to been put down at birth. And Chaz says, so, and John kind of cuts him off and says, now what was that you said about the boy? About Harry and the boy? And then John begins to light a cigarette, and Chaz says, oh, well, it's Harry's kid, isn't it? Supposed to sort of run the business with him. I don't know. Maybe he's the one causing all the trouble. And John says, I can fucking guarantee it. And then he stops and turns to Chaz and says, all right, Chaz, here's the score. When you come crashing into my gaff tonight, when you actually involved me in this, because old John will sort it out, he knows what to do, doesn't he? You opened a can of worms I've been doing me best to forget for 16 fucking years. You think there's nothing scares me? Well, Harry Cooper scares me, mate. Harry and the thing I did for him. And then he turns from Chaz and he begins walking away again, but Chaz just kind of stares dumbly at him, and John continues saying, Harry and his fucking boy. And then we see Chaz sitting down on the grass, and he says, I'm sorry. And John says, yeah, well, don't be. And then John walks over to Chaz and sits on the grass next to him, and he continues saying, it's my fault, Chaz. I knew this had come up sooner or later, but shit. I've just been hoping it wouldn't, you know? Too fucking scared to face up to it, that's all. What it was, right, was Harry's little boy got killed, and Harry wanted me to bring him back from the dead, and I couldn't. And then John looks at Chaz with a very regretful look, and he says, so I brought something else back instead. And with that revelation, that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.